Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks very much for having me. I think you guys are crazy to take any advice from anyone from New York City because the city is totally beautiful. So we can only probably wreck it. But I guess, you know, I haven't done the commute. Everyone I say that to, they're like, well, you haven't tried to commute from Richmond, have you? So I don't know. But seriously, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Let's get right into it. I guess I wanted to start to try to explain livable streets through this project, which I imagine, so how many of you have heard of Parking Day or aware of it? So good, so most of you. So September 2005, this group of artists in San Francisco, downtown, they went out there and rolled out some grass sod in a parking spot, in an on-street parking spot against a parking meter, and put down a little tree and a bench, and essentially said, this spot in this kind of gritty downtown area with very little green space near City Hall in San Francisco is now a park. And they called it parking. They gave it a clever name. And this particular image really just went completely viral. It was all over the internet. I probably had 10 or 12 different people send it to me. And the reason why was because at the time I was developing this new website called Streetsblog. And Streetsblog, thinking 2005, 2006, when this was starting, blogging was not necessarily a career option at all. I literally applied for grad schools at the same time. I was like, geez, this is not going to work probably. But I was starting up this blog because I was part of a community in New York City that was really trying to change the way that the city thought about its streets and public spaces. We were seeing really interesting experiments and projects happening all around the world in this kind of early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s period, such as Paris Plage, the Paris Beach Project. Mayor Bertrand Delanoë, the new mayor, new as of 2001, in Paris was, declaring war on the automobile. And I love this quote because it just strikes me as so French. You would never hear, and certainly not an American mayor say that. Probably not a Canadian one either. And Paris was really aggressively reallocating its street space from cars to more efficient modes of transport, like the Mobilienne bus system. It was laying the groundwork for what would later become the Vélib bike sharing program, which was really the first big city attempt at doing bike sharing. And I wish Vancouver had that right now, because I would have used it for the last day or so, helmetless even. But bike sharing, as we know now, has become this kind of widespread idea. So what we were seeing is these new ideas popping up and really spreading quickly. Looking over at London, in this early 2000s period, we saw congestion charging starting to happen, where drivers who were driving into the very congested downtown sections of London were being asked to pay a fee to do that, and the money was almost entirely going toward transit and biking and walking projects. We saw Trafalgar Square, or at least a big chunk of it, converted to a car-free, pedestrian-friendly space. And these projects, too, began to expand, where London started to really experiment with how it shaped its streets. Streets could be more than just places to store and move motor vehicles. And you could divide streets up not just by space, but by time, too. Different times of day, different times of year, the streets could be different. More recently, London has experimented with this idea of shared space on Exhibition Road. So essentially turning this entire street into a plaza. Cars can still go there, but it's almost like the cars are driving through a living room. And buses go there too. But the shared space design has completely changed the environment there. We were looking a lot at Copenhagen, the New York advocates and activists, and we were starting to bring people from Copenhagen over. We wanted to know how this city had gone from a pretty car-oriented city in the 1960s to a place where more than 40% of commuters were traveling by bicycle, where people could very safely and easily take their children where elderly people could travel by bicycle very safely and easily. And we were also looking at Seoul, South Korea, which had essentially taken a elevated highway built in the 70s and turned it back into the river that it once was running through the city. And in fact, the mayor who did this project, it was a politically successful enough project that he became the president of South Korea. And here you see an image of where they even left little pieces of the old highway there. And we were also looking at Bogota, Colombia. So not just what you'd consider very high-tech, first world, Western European, Asian places, Bogota, Colombia. And watching them experiment with this idea called cyclovia, car-free Sundays throughout the city, and developing this kind of remarkable bus rapid transit system. And I wanted to just pause here because I know that this is a big issue in Vancouver now, this whole question of how transit should be built out. So I want to show you this little snippet of video so you can get a better sense of what this looked like in Bogota. See if it works.
Who is the brother of the former mayor
transit, an economical model specially developed to operate in Bogota in the main corridors, with the objective is to give a segregated lane, exclusive lane for big buses, in order to the people can move very quickly, but with 10 times less the cost of the traditional mass transit system in the world.
Some people call it surface subway, and you can kind of see why. It's buses on rubber wheels, you know, just like you see buses in New York. But what you see they've done is, like, in the middle of these busy multi-lane avenues, almost highways, they've taken away a couple lanes in the middle, and they've built these stations. And next to the stations, you'll see usually 2 lanes of buses running on either side. You know, you have a lane for local bus traffic and for buses to pull into the station, and you have another lane for the express buses. The buses pull right up to the platform so that the floor of the bus is level with the floor of the station. So it's really easy for wheelchairs and you know, older people and people pushing strollers to get on and off the buses. I got to interview the CEO.
Okay, that's enough of Bogota. So, yeah, so surface subway. And actually it's interesting because in a lot of ways the bus, the Transmilenio, is now, a few years later, considered a bit of a victim of its own success. It's gotten very busy and crowded. So it's the story has definitely advanced and changed. And that might be worth talking about later. But, you know, meanwhile, back in New York City, so we're looking at all these other cities, and we have a mayor who actually is a really excellent urbanist mayor, but as late as 2006 was still saying things like, you know, we like traffic is good, it means economic activity, you know, and really we were still living in this 20th century period where the planning and the design and the management of our streets and our public spaces was really oriented toward the motor vehicle. One group called the Partnership for New York City did an estimate, suggested that New York City was losing $13 billion per year in productivity lost due to traffic congestion alone. For me, I mean, one of the big things that pushed me into this set of issues was just the quality of life that traffic creates. It's hard to describe without actually seeing it. This is one of my favorite little hacks that actually existed on my block, and sort of an accurate description, I think. But, you know, I was doing a lot of web producer work at this time, and I started to think of the street outside of my house as just another kind of user interface. And I wanted to know who the heck is in charge of this user interface, because it's a horrible user experience to live in a place that is just absolutely choked in by cars. And by the way, it's a horrible user experience to be in the cars too. Like, it's really not working for anybody. With Streetsblog, one of the things we really wanted to remind people is that city streets weren't always just designed for motor vehicles. It's, you know, it's been generations since we had streets like this in our cities, so we mostly have forgotten that streets were once vibrant, mixed-use places where children played games, and we really squeezed all this activity to the margins, to parks and playgrounds and sidewalks, and allowed the automobile to kind of annex public space. Park Avenue, famous street in Manhattan, was once a park. It's kind of hard to believe. And Jane Jacobs, I think, I really like this quote of hers. I think it sums it up really nicely, that the erosion of cities by automobiles entails so familiar a series of events that they hardly need describing. The erosion proceeds as a kind of nibbling. And here you see the sidewalks and the front stoops on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan being nibbled away. And I like nibbling because there's a kind of mindless quality to nibbling, isn't there? You know, when you're nibbling on chips or something like that. It's not planning, it's the opposite of planning. But you know, there was never really a vote or a community process that said, let's do this. It was sort of, we just sort of did it. Space, obviously, incredibly precious and valuable commodity in cities. Cars, motor vehicles take up a lot of space. If you're trying to move people through a city, this is the number of people crossing a 3.5 meter wide space in an urban environment during a 1 hour period. Different modes are compared. And if you just look at a 3.5 meter space, you know, pedestrians and bikes are vastly more efficient than cars, obviously not to get 20 miles or 30 miles, but for just a dense urban space, the car is incredibly inefficient. And as Fred Kent from Project for Public Spaces often likes to say, if you design your city for cars and traffic, that is what you'll get. You'll get cars and traffic. If, however, you design your city for people and places, you will get people in great places. You know, that's what you will get. So anyways, back to parking day. This photo comes across my desk in late 2005 when I'm developing this blog. And I was just like, man, these people, you know, whoever did this, the crazy group of artists who did this in San Francisco, they nailed this. Like, they described livable streets. You know, we were developing policy papers and strategy meetings, and all these advocates were like, how are we going to convey these messages to policymakers in New York City? It was like, well, they did it. They figured it out. That's it. Like, that's the idea right there, that, you know, this parking spot could be used for something else, this metered parking space. Who says it has to be just for this one thing of storing a private motor vehicle? And so obviously we went out and we did our own parking spot squat in Brooklyn, and we were not the only ones to do that. People started calling these artists in San Francisco. They're called the Rebar Group. And they started fielding all these calls, and people would be like, hey, could you come to Cleveland and do a parking day for us? And they said, you know what? You don't need us to come in and do that for you. And this I think, is an important element to all this. They kind of had this new attitude, in a lot of ways, of open source software. They said, let's open source this idea of parking day. Like, I'm not going to turn this into a consulting firm where I can charge you fees to make a parking day for you. I'm going to make this open so that you can do your own in your own way with your own community. So they created this manual. And in 2006, they set a day, I think it was like September 21st or something, 2006, said this is going to be parking day. And lo and behold, 13 cities, 3 different countries, 47 parks popped up. The next year, same thing, but even more, 200 parks in 50 cities. And the next year, it had spread to 100 cities. And so communities were starting to get more and more creative with their designs and trying different things. And I remember in Brooklyn, we had teachers going out and doing their classes in parking spots. And people really simply liked this idea that a parking spot could be doing more. And I really had to stop and think about that for a while, because on the surface it's very cool and it's catchy and I understood why it was spreading. But I think what was happening with this project is that it was an example of a new generation of city dwellers really participating in the act of urban design and planning and development in a different way than a previous generation. They were essentially hacking a parking spot. I mean, these are people who grew up with computers and with user interfaces, and the idea that you can tweak and play with these things and hack them. And what I saw was ideas from the world of web-based software design and development being applied to the city. You can hack a parking spot just like you can hack a computer, and a parking spot can be a kind of API, so an application programming interface. That's the thing, the little set of instructions essentially that lets any third-party developer make an app for an iPhone. The third-party developer, the person who makes your, I don't know, name the app, your whatever app you like to use on your phone, that person has an API that lets him plug in to the phone. So the parking meter was being treated like an API in a way. Like, we can run any kind of program at this parking meter. We can park cars here, or we can do something else. And by 2011, this thing had spread all over the world. What then became really interesting was that this project went beyond just being a fun art project. It actually became policy in a bunch of different cities, which I thought was pretty mind-blowing. That you saw the Rebar Group themselves actually being hired by the city of San Francisco's planning department to start to do pavement to parks programs. So the city of San Francisco was like, you know what, that's a really cool idea and we should be doing that. Today there are well over 40 parks and plazas all over San Francisco, working with different community partners to transform these little street spaces, usually in front of businesses like cafes and coffee shops and restaurants that could use more seating. Not to be outdone, because cities start to compete with each other when these things start to happen. New York City said, well, we're going to do pop-up cafes. And pop-up cafes look like this at first. So here's a 50-seater in front of a restaurant in Lower Manhattan that had very little of one of these little narrow shotgun restaurants. That they were just ecstatic to have more seating out there. And it was very clear right away that this was a kind of economic development program. Again, not just a crazy art project, but this streetscape redesign was actually generating, increases in sales for the business that, had the pop-up cafe in front of it, and increased tax revenue for the city. And in New York City, that's what moves New York City, for better or worse, is, show me the money. And then again, very exportable. These ideas spread. So Chicago developed people spots, and other cities developed their own versions. And let's just take another closer little look at what this is.
We're here in the middle of the San Jose Ferrero Pavements Parks Trial Plaza, which is really exciting because right where I'm sitting about a year ago would have been a street. Now we have this trial pedestrian plaza, mini park, if you will, and it's part of the Pavement to Parks program. It's an innovative initiative led by the mayor and the planning department here in San Francisco to take underutilized street space and give it back to people.
So here behind us is the city's first park plan, which is a new design typology under the Pavement to Parks program. And the idea here really is to sort of very simply and relatively cheaply build out a platform into the parking lane, essentially taking the grade of the sidewalk out into the street, and just providing on top of that the end of last year, we sort of got the idea sort of inspired by the reclamation of parking lanes, with programs like Parking Day and such, to really think about ways that we could sort of have smaller scale interventions in places where we had a lot of commercial activity, a lot of pedestrian activity on the streets, a lot of bicyclist activity, and looking for places where we could really repurpose and sort of more actively distribute the limited road right away.
Not from down south, there's just so many kind of suburban strip mall, aimless places of all kind of the same thing. And places like this just have a unique character that I think is really great.
What's not?
Okay, you get the idea. So this crazy little art project essentially starts to morph into public policy. In 2007, in New York City, this really kind of took the next leap when this woman, Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, was chosen as our DOT commissioner. And for Streetsblog, this was really an important moment because the blog was largely set up to try to kind of help move along her predecessor, essentially. There was a sense that New York City's DOT was just stuck in this kind of automobile-oriented 20th century mindset, and it needed new thinking. One of the first things Jeanette did was create the Sustainable Streets Strategic Plan. So start to look at streets as an asset that could help move a city toward long-term sustainability, which is a very different way of looking at streets. It wasn't just about how many cars can you move on a given day or at a given hour. It was about a much bigger set of issues. So economic issues, environmental issues, social issues, all of these new criteria were being used to judge the performance of streets. One of the first projects, which is almost a kind of urban acupuncture project, was this little project in Brooklyn in a neighborhood called Dumbo, Pearl Street. And this kind of crummy little triangular trash-strewn parking lot at the end of a building was sort of painted green, and the traffic engineers were very concerned. Like they even made sure that those white lines around the green were double white lines, because double white lines mean cars can't cross. So it's still very much in this like car paradigm. But basically a park was created instantly. Move the cars, paint green, get a community partner, which is great community partners and all these local artists to sort of put benches and art and take care of stuff in the plaza. And all of a sudden, like Parking Day, you have this paradigm shift in this little section. And again, similarly to the pop-up cafes, you start to see economic benefits accruing. So at Pearl Street, there was a 172% increase in sales. So again, New York City, it's about business, it's about moving, it's about economic development. So this was very compelling. And so the DOT began to really take on all kinds of projects. So 9th Avenue at 14th Street, turn it into a plaza. It used to be the most dangerous intersection in that chunk of Manhattan. Highway-like avenues being turned into much more complete streets. So streets where actual lanes were kind of removed from motor vehicles and reallocated to bicycles in this case. But also you'll notice that in the image at the bottom, the pedestrian crossings are shorter here. So one of the really interesting outcomes of these kinds of redesigns, very consistently, was that injuries, crashes, and fatalities were substantially reduced in virtually every single one of these projects, because vehicle speeds went down, pedestrian crossings were shorter, bikes had a safe place to go. It made a huge difference. Really iconic, important public spaces like Herald Square, Manhattan, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade goes through here. Were just sort of shut down and turned into pedestrian plazas. And almost instantly, as soon as the paint goes down on the ground, version 1.0 of these things, it's not even very pretty. It's chairs from Target or Home Depot are out there. People just sit down. There's just this huge demand for places in the urban realm where you can kind of take a load off. On projects like this in Times Square, Broadway through Times Square, probably the most iconic public space in America. This had been on the drawing board since 1969. People had been talking about taking Broadway out of the street network and pedestrianizing it. And this idea of quick and cheap and light materials really helped make it happen. So it wasn't, you know, a multi-million dollar capital project that took planning and political sign-off. It was just like, hey, this is an experiment. We're going to throw this red paint on the ground. We're going to put these cheap umbrellas out here. We're going to, you know, get some cheap chairs from literally from Lowe's or Home Depot. They just went out one day and bought some chairs. We're going to throw them on the ground and we're going to see if this works. And if the traffic cataclysm happens that everybody, you know, all the critics are saying is going to happen, we can scrape this stuff off the ground and restore it to its, you know, former glory as a traffic sewer. So, you know, we started to see, again, during this whole recession of 2008 when, you know, the real estate market was hit incredibly hard in New York and all across America, one of the only places that not only retained its kind of value for landlords, the ground floor retail rates, rental rates, but actually increased in value was Times Square. So for better or worse, and of course there's like a gentrification effect there, but for better or worse, this place became a more valuable place thanks to the, we think, thanks to the pedestrianization. Really innovative ideas about how to use streets differently at different times also started to happen. So the cyclovia concept that we saw in Bogota became summer streets in New York City. So this idea that, you know, you could have a car-free street on a Sunday in the summer, and you could take dumpsters and turn them into swimming pools and put them in front of Grand Central Terminal and create, you know, instant swimming pools where nothing existed but a kind of traffic-choked street. And a street could be a yoga studio. Just a complete reconception of what a street could be. This is, again, Times Square. Not just happening in the urban core and the kind of wealthy central business district, but also out into the boroughs. There's been the spread of these ideas as well. So this is Williamsburg Walks in a section of Brooklyn called Williamsburg. And not just bikes and pedestrians, but transit too. Harder, slower, more expensive, but the sort of reallocation of street space away from cars to transit has also been an important part of this. And the development of what's called select bus service has been really important. And again, the economic benefits, the safety benefits seem to be accruing on these corridors where select bus service goes in. So this idea of like slowly, incrementally changing these streets and using these inexpensive materials, testing things out. Again, to me, this looks a lot more like software development than what we typically have known as city development, where it's like big, centralized, top-down, expensive infrastructure projects. And where is it going? So here's one place where it could be going. And this is a very recent street film by Clarence, and I felt like I had to show it, because Zurich is just kind of incredible.
So in the 90s, they had something called the historical compromise, which is like this over-the-top statement when they talk about transportation policy. The compromise was that no new parking would be built in Zurich unless they
stop it there. So one of the themes that comes up again and again when you start looking at these cities that are really making the move toward livable streets is that parking is not a particularly valuable use of this kind of incredibly expensive and rare urban land that we have. That allowing people to store their private motor vehicles in this land is just not a good use of urban public space. So it's interesting that for Zurich, they had this kind of historic compromise, which implies that it was probably not easy to get done, but they limited parking, which is what allows so much of what they do now. In New York, to sort of jump back, I think the most dramatic thing that we've seen in the last 7 years has been this explosion of bicycling. And you guys, you have some great bike facilities in Vancouver as well, so it's not necessarily news, but this is an example of the kind of facility that we're starting to see in New York. And again, lots of evidence that these bike lanes are creating safer streets and more, are turning out to be good for merchants who sometimes are opposed to these projects at first. And then putting it all together, this whole idea of complete streets, that you can have a bus lane, you can have a bike lane. I don't think this street is particularly pretty. I think we can do a better job of making it look kind of less highway-like, and there's still a lot of work to do. But the bottom line is that these projects, which are going in relatively quickly and cheaply, they don't cost a lot, have created a 4x increase in biking since 2000, and it's probably closer to 5x at this point. We're seeing bicycling becoming much more mainstream. So guys like this, with a tie and a phone. We're seeing biking becoming very fashionable. It's like, it's cool, it's sexy. We're seeing 90-year-old guys on bicycles. And this is a big change. You'll notice, again, not wearing a helmet. None of those people were. It's not necessarily, if you're biking on an upright tricycle, and you're 90 years old, you can probably, figure out whether or not you need a helmet. And we're seeing a lot more families starting to move around by bike. And that's kind of one of the most phenomenal things. This family actually happens to be a famous Hollywood family, Liev Schreiber and Naomi Watts, the actors. They have a great bike, and you can often see them rolling through Manhattan on their special family bike. But their kids enjoy it. It's not like a chore. And this is how I get my kids around too, and it's actually very pleasant. And again, it's not just a New York City phenomenon. This is the Streetsblog network. So we kind of keep track of all these different Streetsblog-like websites all around the country. And we're just seeing this explosion of interest in the last 7 years in this stuff. So Milwaukee Avenue in Chicago, 15th Street in Washington, D.C., very similar designs spreading all over the place. San Francisco just got this one in, Polk Street. And of course, taken yesterday, Hornby Street, which, I got on this rental bike, and one of the first things I see is like a 7-year-old kid, 6-year-old kid biking along, which is really, to me, just the indicator. It's like the canary in the coal mine that, like, you've got a healthy bike culture emerging. The streets should be safe enough for this kid to bike on his own. Unfortunately, the move to better biking also comes with a dark side, which my colleague Doug Gordon and I have labeled as bike lash. Which I know that you've experienced here as well. I wanted to just talk a little bit, because often this stuff gets presented as like a design problem only, or an urban planning problem, but it's also a political problem. And a lot of this, if you want to make these changes, you're really dealing in the political realm. You're talking about reallocating resources, public resources, and that's politics. Patient zero of the bike lash, I think the most extreme case of bike lash ever, happened here in my own neighborhood, Prospect Park West. It's about 2 miles from Lower Manhattan. It's a 1-mile stretch of street that runs along a very beautiful Olmsted and Vox designed park. It's a very fancy neighborhood. Actually, Vancouver might be one of the only places in North America that's not impressed with an $8.45 million house, right? That's like, oh, that's cheap. That's great. But the safety problem had been a big issue. They used to have something called the death-o-meter, keeping track of the number of people who are being run over near Prospect Park West. We had advocates going out with speed guns, sort of clocking people going 65 miles an hour on Prospect Park West. And around the same time that Streetsblog began, we started this whole community process to start to rethink the way that transportation was happening on the local level. Years of advocacy work and community workshops, and we really felt like, you know, we were doing the community process piece the way it should be done. And so finally, many years into this process, in 2010, the Department of Transportation finally went in and took this kind of 3-lane speedway and turned it into one of these more complete streets with a 2-lane, 2-way bike lane running it against the park. And they even made leaves grow on the trees. And it's always good to do your before and after photos in different seasons. So, but it pretty much immediately became this really beautiful street for biking and a lot safer to walk across as well. It was just transformed. You began, like Hornby Street the other day, you saw little kids biking all the time. You saw people, you know, shopping with their groceries, people going out of their way to be on this safer street. The preliminary data was all really good. The number of bikes were way up. The speeding by cars was way down. Bikes were off of the sidewalk. You know, crashes seemed to be going down. But of course, as is often the case in these situations, not everybody was happy. And one of the great indicators of bike lash is often a 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper with extreme punctuation going up on car windshields in the neighborhood. So, you know, afraid to stop or even open your car door, you can't park, can't cross the street. So real kind of hysteric response. And this was not, it turned out, your typical group of NIMBYs. This group was apparently being led by a former deputy mayor and the former DOT commissioner, the person that, in fact, Streetsblog had sort of set up to kind of move along to other things, Commissioner Iris Weinshaw. And her husband, actually very powerful guy, wrong slide, sorry, that is U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer. U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer. So this was an incredibly powerful group. They actually got a very big law firm called Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher to kind of do their bidding pro bono. And this guy, this law firm that had actually represented George W. Bush in a small case called, you know, Bush versus Gore 2000. This law firm was now suing our bike lane. So, and the guy was going on TV saying this was the worst thing he'd ever, like this guy had prosecuted narco traffickers in Central America, and this bike lane was the worst thing he'd ever seen. So hire him if you ever need a lawyer. And they were going out. Like, it was a very emotionally, you know, very intensely felt issue. People were hitting the streets. And again, I think someone wisely told them to put this particular sign down. You know, it seemed like this was really the issue, right? Like, bike lane equals fewer parking spots. What was interesting in this case, and why it's worth bringing up, I think, is the fact that it became this citywide issue. So it was a case of bike lash that just metastasized, and it spread. And you started to see these headlines in the tabloids, and every day it was another story like this. We had CBS 2 running a series called Bike Bedlam.
More bike bedlam hits the city. The Department of Transportation starts installing new bike lanes in heavy traffic areas. CBS 2 political reporter Marcia Kramer has that story.
You have to wonder what they're thinking, installing bike lanes on 1st and 2nd Avenues from 34th to 59th Streets, an area already so congested at rush hour you can barely move.
Oh, I don't think it's going to work.
Bruce Silverblatt's group, the Turtle Bay Association, took pictures to show how the 1st Avenue approach to the 59th Street Bridge is already congested.
That anybody trying to ride a bike is taking their life in hand.
But CBS 2 saw other potential dangers. Buses come down 48th Street and travel 1 block to 49th Street to turn around. They have to cross the new bike lanes twice within a single block. Tour buses do it too. A 2nd Avenue bike lane is next to the Israeli consulate. Imagine if the man on the bike was a terrorist. And on 1st Avenue...
Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. Imagine if the man on a bike was a terrorist. They're just throwing everything they can at the bikes. It was insane. It was completely insane. And this whole notion of like, this street is so horribly, like everyone's acknowledging this street is completely dysfunctional and broken. It's bedlam, it's traffic congestion, there's no room here. So therefore we should not do anything to change it. Seems to be the argument in these cases lots of times. And you could all just kind of like laugh it off. Except it was actually becoming this issue in the mayoral race. And I don't know if you guys remember Anthony Weiner. Did he make it to Canada? Okay, I'm sorry. Apologize for that. So when he becomes mayor, you know what he's going to do? I'm going to spend my first year I'm going to have a bunch of ribbon cuttings tearing out your effing bike lanes. That's what he apparently told Mayor Bloomberg at an event they attended. And even the more reasonable candidates like Bill de Blasio, who is actually a neighbor of mine and became our mayor, was really sending these sort of disappointing signals. There was just this sense that this bike stuff was a kind of toxic issue, even though poll after poll showed that the livable streets, plazas, bicycles, all these projects were actually polling much higher than any of the candidates themselves. I felt like we had to take the issue seriously. I had watched very closely what had happened in San Francisco from 2007 to 2010, which was this injunction took place where the city, due to a lawsuit based on the Clean Air Act, actually, so was essentially stopped the city from developing any new bike infrastructure for almost 4 years. Nothing. The city could not even install a bike rack. And the argument there was that the bike network was illegal according to the Clean Air Act because potentially bike lanes would create more traffic congestion for cars. And if that were the case, cars would emit more pollutants into the air because they're stuck in traffic, and therefore bikes created more pollution. And this was enough of an argument to succeed in stopping this bike stuff for 4 years. I was also, I'm proud to say, a very early observer of Toronto's Rob Ford. He, kind of swept in after Mayor David Miller, who had done a lot of progressive stuff in the urban design realm. Roads are built for buses and cars and trucks, not for people on bikes. Cyclists are a pain in the ass to motorists. Yes, I have smoked crack cocaine. I really did feel like when all the Americans were catching on to Rob Ford, I was like, come on, guys, I've been watching this guy for 3 years. And I was watching him because of what they did on Jarvis Street, where they had built a pretty nice bike lane, and Ford came in and removed it right away. And I thought, well, this could happen in New York in 2013. So what are we going to do to kind of protect these gains that we've been making? Like, how do you beat back bike lash, and how do you win change? And for those of you who are interested in that political question, I'll give you a few tips. First and foremost, for me at least, I think having your own media channel at this point, and I think if you're an urban designer, if you're a planner, if you're trying to do anything in the public realm in terms of changing cities, it really helps to have your own media channels, whether it's even if it's just a Twitter account. We had our own blog. I remember what it was like in the old days. This is what it looked like in the old days. In the old days is like the mid-90s, where if you wanted to get the word out about something happening in the realm of advocacy, you kind of literally had to walk down the street and stick flyers up on lampposts or put them in the spokes of bikes or something. Now we had our own hashtag. Like this simple Twitter hashtag could reach hundreds or even thousands of people with, instantly at virtually no cost. These tools during the Prospect Park West bike battle were incredibly useful. I mean, one of the most shocking things was the opponents of this bike lane actually set up their own Facebook group. It was literally the first time we'd seen one of these NIMBY groups really take advantage of these social media tools. They tended to be kind of an older generation and not very savvy with these tools. But you got to remember, you're the next generation, you're the younger generation. So, and I don't even count myself among the younger generation anymore necessarily, but you got to use these technologies because it's one of the advantages that you have. So we were always able to kind of outnumber them in any social media venue. And politicians, look at that. This is a form of polling in a way. Strong local advocacy organizations are key to these efforts. So whatever you're pushing for in your kind of urban design or planning realm, it really helps to have good advocacy groups. All over the country now, you see these great bike advocacy groups that are doing really good work. And you've got to be really clear about what the problem is. You know, on Prospect Park West, the problem was cars could go too fast. And every once in a while, one of them would roll up on the sidewalk and be upside down, you know, while kids were walking to school. And how is that acceptable? How is that okay? So you have to show what you're trying to do. Like, why are we out here doing this? So we put together an event. We said, you know what, we're going to just have, they kept kind of trying to portray us as outsiders, not the community. So we said, you know what, we're going to show you who we are and what we're trying to do. We're trying to make safe streets for families and kids and everyone in Brooklyn. So we created this event called We Ride the Lanes, and we did that. And it's really important to be out there on the street. It's really important. Like, you can't just be online. Like, you've got to show up. You've got to go to these meetings. And recognize that the bike lash stuff is so predictable that literally, like, one group called Bike Pittsburgh, they made a bike lash bingo board out of it. So see if I can remember. So these are like comments that you typically see on any story about bikes in America. And I'm sure the same is true here, but, like, you know, oh, cyclists run red lights, you know, bikes are for kids, bikes slow me down. You know, you could just sort of like bingo-ize any comment thread. And again, it's like, you see it again and again in these cases that, you know, the cyclists are the outsider. We will never be Amsterdam. We will never be Copenhagen. We'll never be Portland. You know, we're Brooklyn. We're going to be choked with traffic. They say it in Chicago too. This is, you know, this is a city made for people who want to go from point A to point B. This is not some Seattle coffee grunge pothead experiment. It's not Vancouver. This is Chicago. So every city has this, you know, where it's like the people trying to make the change are outsiders and weirdos. So you just got to show them who you are. It's like, no, we're like people who live here. We have kids. And you got to show up to the meetings, which is really painful at times. But, you know, show up to the meetings and make sure that you are visible. So in this case, you see everybody who supports the bike lane is wearing a sticker on their chest. Someone jumped up on stage, kind of, this was illegal, the process, and said, okay, if you're a supporter, would you please raise your hand? And you raise your hand because inevitably a reporter will come to this meeting and the reporters want it to be a conflict. So they report, you know, Jim said the bike lane is bad, Sally said the bike lane is good. And that's all you see, you know, you just see this sort of 50-50 thing. So it's really important to make yourselves visible in your own media channels. And, you know, I really like this Elizabeth Warren quote because I think it's so true that, you know, if you don't have a seat at the table, then, you know, someone else is going to be deciding for you. You're probably on the menu. And one of the best outcomes of the great bike lash of 2010 and 11 was this new organization called Streetsblog, which really just decided, you know what, these are political issues. These are not just planning and design issues, and we need to have our own organization that plays the political ballgame, funds candidates, volunteers for candidates, really works for candidates who are supporting livable streets. And this was incredibly successful. It took more than a year in court. This particular project we won. We sort of defeated the bike lash. Even Senator Schumer now is on the bike lane, you know. So next on the agenda, and I'm just pretty much wrapping up here, but what Streetsblog and others have moved on to in New York is this whole issue of Vision Zero. And I think it's an interesting thing because it sort of, it creates a kind of moral dimension to what we're doing in our planning and design work. This notion that, you know, streets should not kill people. Vision Zero is a Swedish idea, a policy that says we should design a transportation system that causes 0 fatalities. That should be our goal. It's not acceptable to have anyone getting killed by cars on our streets. You know, in New York City, you know, when a crane falls down, a construction crane kills 4 people, you got politicians saying, you know, this is a disgrace, you know, we need better inspection, more resources. When, you know, the wide receiver who caught the winning pass in the Super Bowl accidentally discharges a gun in a club, it falls out of his waistband. People go absolutely bonkers, as well they should. But when a van, you know, runs over 2 preschoolers on Canal Street, everybody reports it as an accident, quote unquote accident. All these car killings are accidents, like, oh, somebody spilled milk, you know, really implying like no fault. It's almost as if the police and the tabloids go out of their way to kind of write these things off. And so right now in New York, for the Livable Streets community, this is really the big issue. It's like changing the state of affairs where it is essentially legal to kill someone on the streets of New York when a car is used as the weapon. If you stay at the scene as the driver, if you are sober, if your paperwork is, in fact, we just had one where the person was not even licensed, the police will, almost in every case, let you get away with nothing more than a failure to yield summons. And that's not okay. And that's the case in a lot of American cities right now. So the benefits of livable streets: improved mobility, more people can move through intersections, more people can move around your city, increasing safety, enhancing quality of life, improving your city's economic prospects, making the city more equitable. We didn't talk much about that, but cars are in fact extraordinarily expensive to run and to maintain. If you have a city that requires everybody has a car, you're not an equitable city. Public health, people are healthier when they bike and walk and have ways to bike and walk. Happiness, Charles Montgomery here from Vancouver wrote the book on that. And community building and democracy. I think this is a really important piece of it. And I'll show you one more video clip that kind of delves into that. And it's about this idea called tactical urbanism, which is what I want to finish on. And really, it's a kind of new and emerging mode of city making, where people are essentially taking city making into their own hands, very much like that Parking Day project. One of the best groups at doing this is the Dallas, Texas Build a Better Block group. I'll just let Jason explain it to you.
My name is Jason Roberts, and welcome to Oak Cliff, Texas. Oak Cliff is kind of an inner city suburb of downtown Dallas. It was an old streetcar suburb. We're at our 4th anniversary Better Block project. It started here. We did our first project, and now of course it's gone all over the world. This is kind of a celebration of that. On the East Coast, we saw the plaza programs that were occurring, and we thought, well, we could create walkable, bikeable green spaces in our communities, but we want a lot to walk and bike too. So we had to fix the buildings and the streets and the sidewalks. So the Better Block was really taking a lot of the best of those ideas and putting it into an entire block. We're going to take a street here that we found is not needed, and we're going to turn it into a plaza. This is an effort that we looked at and we thought we want to create more plazas in our community and line them with food, with landscaping and trees, bring out public art, create stages for the community.
Well, we're doing some traffic calming here, using some simple duct tape as our white stripes, and we're taking this 3-lane one-way street down to 1, creating a crosswalk, making it a lot easier to park here as well. I think the speed's already gone down, so anybody walking across the street feels safe, and we're going to do it in a couple hours.
So we're going to add some new striping, create a new edge here, so it makes it a little tighter, make the intersection kind of close in a bit more, so it's safer for pedestrians to cross. And we're going to add new crosswalks as well. We're going to use temporary materials.
Well, Brandon Castillo salvaged some wraps and scanned some cars in T-Bellum, brought them over to Oakland, and I cut them up, and we have a prefab crosswalk.
This project is amazing. Look at me crossing the street on Tyler. Not worried about my life. It's great.
So one of the major things we have to do is focus on bringing more shade to the area because Dallas is really hot. It's really hot. On our projects in the south, we really like to see if we can get large trees brought in and try to create give them an inside of a room outdoors.
All right, we'll cut it there. You know, the band is pretty good, but so there's this old 20th century model of urban design and development, and this guy is sort of the symbol of it. Robert Moses, the great master planner of New York City, sort of laid down all the highways, and a lot of what we live in today was from his design. It's a centralized mode. It's bureaucratic. It's often very expensive. It's often very laden with debt, money that we don't necessarily have anymore. It can be very slow and controlled, by experts and authorities. It's inflexible. But there's this change underway, and it's kind of moving away from this model, the sort of top-down computer mainframe model, and is moving toward something more like this. This is called the lean startup loop. A guy named Eric Ries developed this idea that the way to develop software projects is to start with an idea, you build it, You get it out to users as quickly as possible so you can start to measure it and see how people use it. It's not done. In fact, it's often quite broken. It's why, if you're smart, you never download Apple software, and it's 0.0 time. You let someone else do that, test it out for you. You learn and you iterate. You do it again. And when you saw a lot of the projects I showed you today are being done in that mode. So it allows for people to sort of participate in the development of their own streets and their own cities. For me, it makes a lot of sense that this would be a good model for developing cities. Cities are the original social media. They are the medium that we humans created so that we could exchange ideas and goods and services. Before we had Twitter and Amazon and eBay, we had cities. We had the agora. We had the marketplace, public space. It's where we came to meet each other, to exchange. So it makes sense to me that the mode that we use to design and develop social media and software today would also help inform the design and development of our cities. And for all you designers and developers out there, planners, I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and we have time for questions. So,
thank you very much for the nice talk here.
Thank you.
I appreciate a lot the sort of bottom-up approach to creating livable streets. But I have a question.
Yeah.
You can just look, for example, at our bike lanes here in Vancouver as an example, and many of the examples that you showed. And you said it yourself at one point during the lecture. So much of what's created is phenomenally ugly. The temporary plastic tubs, the holy plants on Hornby Street, the bright green that's, I guess, safe, but also phenomenally ugly bike lanes. And when I think about really, really beautiful and incredibly designed public spaces, they're not this kind of funky temporary stuff. And so what is the long-term prospect? Is it, where do you think these really great ideas, which start from the ground up, do they have the potential actually to become really beautifully designed spaces eventually?
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. I mean, so it's too bad I didn't show you more pictures of Times Square, where it's gone in the last 7 years. It's probably on its 5.0 version now. And the architecture firm Snøhetta, yeah, they are actually designing permanent sections of it. And one person might think it's ugly and another person might think it's beautiful. I think the way they're designing is very nice. But it really took 4 pretty ugly versions and about 7 years to get to that capital project. But to me, the point is we never would have even gotten to that without the ugly temporary stuff. It just allowed people to relax and see, like, okay, you can make this change. You can put a bike lane on Hornby Street. Now we know, I don't know, maybe it has backed up traffic all the way to, Surrey or whatever it's done, horrible thing. But you can do this change and it's not going to kill everybody in the neighborhood. It's not going to kill the businesses. It's not going to kill the traffic congestion. You kind of have to find a way to get through that. And when you're just looking at plans on paper and doing the traditional kind of community workshop process, those processes just create so much anxiety. So this kind of mode of real-time rendering, I think, really helps.
So how do you then get the next step? So let's say the bike lanes on Hornby, they work. How do you then convince the city actually to invest in that and make it really?
Yeah, well, so in New York, that's why I kept showing you this data about economic development. That was the way it worked in New York, was we had to show, like, these things are actually good for the local economy, so we should invest in them. And it would be worth investing in them because, presumably the tax base will increase and there will be economic benefits. In Vancouver, it might be a different set of arguments. Maybe people care enough about things looking beautiful that that's good enough. She's saying no, that's not the way it is.
I do have a comment.
Yeah.
If I may, sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
But Carroll Street in downtown is somehow just been renovated and rehabilitated by the city of Vancouver to the level of the standard that we were speaking of. It's been beautifully done. And they're in the Olympics.
Other questions? Yes, you, sir.
You showed the last example you showed was Dallas and their creation of that plaza in the street that they deemed didn't matter anymore. And brings up a number of questions, especially your last little graphic piece where you say you have ideas, build them, test them out, etc. Some of the questions I have are, where does if this is in a residential area, for instance, and we have a lot of problem in this city with public consultation, where does the community consultation come in this process? Who's paying for the trees and this and that? And in Dallas, it looked like they had police helping to guide traffic around. Has this been done in conjunction with city planning departments?
Yeah.
The police and all that stuff?
Right, yeah, those are really good questions. So I just dialed up this, before I get to that, John Massengale just wrote a book, and Victor Dover, about this beauty question, which is totally worth checking out, street design, because he feels the same way that you do, that this stuff is ugly and it should be nicer. So that's a good book to check out if you're interested in that. To your question, it's a great question. So one of the things that I love about the Better Block guys, one of the first things they do in some of their projects is they write down a list of all the ordinances, the local ordinances they're going to break. We're breaking this law, we're breaking that law, we're breaking this one, you could arrest us for this, and they literally hand it to the local authorities. Like, on Saturday, we're going to do this project, and we're going to break all these laws. Are you guys okay with that? And so they do work with the authorities. As far as the community process goes, they only go into places where a community has said, you know, we want to change this space. And we've been, in a lot of cases, they've been doing, you know, charrettes and workshops. They've been talking about it forever, but they just can't get the impetus to do it. So, you know, they say, come, let's do a better block. Come help us do a better block here. And they set a date, they give themselves a deadline, and they say, you know, by this date, we're going to have this space activated in some way that the local community wants it to be done. And so it is a community process. It's the community saying, like, let's do this here, let's do this there. Funding comes from different sources. Sometimes city government funds this stuff, sometimes local community foundations, and sometimes just people in the neighborhood. They've had all this great data now that shows, like, when they do one of these projects, oftentimes they'll see, you know, they'll experiment. They'll do a pop-up coffee shop or a pop-up barbecue joint, and that will work. And the person who ran the coffee shop will say, you know what? Or the landlord who has the building will be like, we should have a coffee shop here. Let's make this permanent. And so they've actually, you know, created investment from just doing these projects. And Team Better Block, like, a lot more information on their website, and more on that, more street film stuff too, if you want more. It's a really interesting project.
Trevor, I think you talked with great illustration of my suspicion that people who like parklets also like apps.
Oh, yeah.
And I have great problems with
geez.
apps and parklets. My phone is so full of apps that do one thing half well, and 20 of them that I'm starting to wonder. And I think a city composed of parklets would be a horror. And we may have that horror city here soon, because they're very politically expedient to build parklets instead of real streets or real cities. Now, go back to your model. The incremental app model was a medieval city. You know, organic, small decisions, individually made, aggregate into a medieval city. In my view, thank God that some regime hunts through Ramblas in Barcelona, or, you know, Haussmann, Sixth, whoever you want to use, even Robert Moses. Here's my question. Your talk was remarkably non-political for a talk about urban design. And I wonder if parklets are a symptom of the politics of our era, where money for public infrastructure and building the streets public realm is not available. So all that's available is the leftover sweeping to roll up the grass for a few days, etc.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you are celebrating, in fact, a failure.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That is actually a critique that I share. It's funny that you bring that up. I mean, you know, a lot of what we're told these days is, oh, there's no money. Like, you can't have new infrastructure. We can't, you know, we can't build anything in this city because there's no money. And I look around New York and Boston, where I was just living, and I see lots of money. It just doesn't belong to the public coffers anymore. It's in private hands. So there's still money out there. It's just not necessarily in public hands. We've moved the money to somewhere else. So I agree with you. I do think that the tactical urbanism stuff is indicative, in fact, of a bit of a failure of our ability as a public to build big things and decide what we want and decide where we want to go as a society. I mean, I don't know that you can build the Burrard Bridge as a tactical urbanism project. I mean, sure, it probably started as ferries, and then maybe it was a pontoon bridge, and then it became a big bridge. But yeah, I think you're onto something there. Yeah.
Got a question over here, and then I'll handle that.
Thanks, that was awesome. I just have a question about community organizing. Like, you made a point about how it's really important to be able to get people out, and you mentioned that you had a ride of 700, there was a ride of 700 people, and, you know, kind of celebrating the parks of the bike lane. And that's something that we struggled with, I know, in Vancouver. We're working on a project to basically create, to basically build support for a redesign of Commercial Drive, which is like a big high street in East Vancouver. And what we found is, even though there's a ton of people, particularly millennials, who are like, yeah, this totally makes sense, it's awesome, what we found is, you know, it's harder to actually get people out to, you know, just go to things that we want people to be at. By the way, we have a talk on November 3rd, so I invite you all to come. But I'm just curious if you have any like general tips for people who are actually doing advocacy work and kind of community organizing work, and any tips on like getting people out to things.
Yeah. Well, so what we've found again and again is the cyclists are like the red meat eaters of the Livable Streets advocacy world. I mean, they're like, tend to be the people who feel most kind of threatened by dangerous streets. You know, if you're trying to bike around and a street is made for cars moving 40 or 50 miles an hour, that's just a very dangerous situation. So people who feel like they have a lot at stake are going to show up at meetings. And often in these situations, that tends to be the bike people. The other group is often the young families. So engaging, you know, in the US, we call them PTAs, parent-teacher associations at schools, people who want to be able to walk and bike and use transit to get their kids to school. That's a very enthusiastic crowd, and they're going to be there for a while. They probably own a place and are going to be in a school for 6 to 12 years. So using these media tools is crucial. You know, that's an advantage that young people have, is they're comfortable with these tools. And there was a final thing that I had too. Oh yeah.
How do you compel people, or I don't know, maybe you don't have a short answer to this, maybe it's not appropriate for now, but how do you compel people from being like supportive to actually, like, you're saying it's important to get people out, like, from being supportive and being like, oh, they're working on this great, to actually being like, I'm going to go and like,
Yeah.
be part of this situation.
Yeah, what is it that gets people out? I mean, does the better block thing look like it could work for you guys? Because I feel like that technique of like, we're going to go out on Commercial Drive and we're going to change this place. We're going to do something on this street, you know, pick your date. People show up for those. Would that work, you think? Or is that just crazy? I mean, that to me is, I mean, you could even engage Team Better Block. Like, you'd say, like, guys, we have this situation and we want to do a project here. People show up for that stuff much more happily than they show up for a community meeting. But yeah, I don't know. It's a really good question. What does make me show up to these meetings? It's That's really when I care a lot. Like I feel like my, my own life or like my kids' lives are at stake because this street is dangerous. That is what gets me out. So I will have to think about that more.
I'd like to know a little bit more about the opposition to livable streets. I mean, while it seems clear that many people just fear change and want to maintain status quo, and so that sort of explains a lot of people who are opposed to change, just that basic fear of change. But are there vested interests who are actively fighting against livable streets?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's different in different places. So in a lot of cities, in the US at least, you have very powerful suburban interests. And the suburban interests are usually aligned with the state government or the province government in Canada. And the people who are pushing for the livable streets are often aligned with, the urban core and the city government. I mean, I know that you guys have similar issues here. So, Syracuse, New York, for example, they really want to tear down a highway that was built through the middle of the city, I think in the 50s. By the way, a mistake that Vancouver amazingly avoided, though I know it also creates its own set of issues. But Syracuse did not avoid that mistake. And now they really have this city that's divided. One side of the highway is African American and poor and lacking opportunity, and the other side of the highway is the sort of the nicer, downtown urban core with the jobs and other services. And this highway could come down. It serves no one, really. It does nothing, except there are these suburban interests who do feel that it is necessary. And the arguments, when you hear them, they're like, well, my commute will be 5 minutes longer by car. Is that really a good, is that a good argument for like having downtown Syracuse be ruined for another 50 years? I think that's the biggest interest group. One of the things that's most remarkable to me is whenever we do these projects, and there is opposition, it's so disorganized. The Prospect Park West thing was unique because the opposition was so organized. Very often it's like the motoring interests are not that well organized, frankly. So.
Time, a couple more for you.
Brings up the speed on Prospect Park. Anyone imagine it could be taken out now? Have you talked to the people who are opposed to it? Do they have such an emotional investment in that they can change, or are they changing?
It's interesting. It's not going to be taken out. It's extremely popular. The new mayor is okay with it. They just repaved it and redid it again. That was going to be the moment when everybody thought, okay, if it's going to get taken out, it's going to be when they repave Prospect Parkway. It's like when these capital projects happen, that's the moment you get to change something. And it just didn't happen. It was repaved. And even like people like me, it was interesting because the night before they were going to repave it, the local city council member called me. And he was like, hey, Aaron, what do you think about the green paint on Prospect Park West? I was like, I'm not a fan of the green paint. And he's like, I think we should get rid of it. And I was like, if you guys wanted to do that, I wouldn't be opposed to it. And I could talk to the other advocates and see. Anyways, a lot of the advocates were in favor of the green paint, so it stayed. But yeah, it's not going to. And in fact, like another interesting thing is one of the people I even showed you in one of those slides, one of the older women who was opposed to this thing, she just died 2 weeks ago. So it's really a generational thing, and this older generation is sort of like not able to, they don't want it, but they're not going to be here as long as the people who do. You guys will win.
So I'm just wondering in terms of messaging, like how you get people to pay attention. Like if you were to boil down like your kind of lessons learned, well, your strategy, what would you consider key things about messaging?
I think more than anything else, we're finding the safety messaging is really where it's at, in part because traffic engineers are professionally bound to these safety standards, and they fail so thoroughly in their own standards. I mean, streets, we have 36,000 people a year being killed by motor vehicles in the United States every year. So when you bring up the safety issue, politicians are really forced to pay attention, and so is the big bureaucracy that actually is in charge of so much of this stuff. So if I had to boil it down to one message, it's the safety message, and the fact that, if a car hits you at, going faster than 30 miles an hour, there's something like an 80% chance that you're going to get killed. If it hits you at 20 miles an hour or less, it's like a 20% chance that you're going to get killed. So, if people have to be responsible for safety, that's something that you can really hold them to. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Aaron.
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
I'm sure that Aaron will stick around for